day going. I hope it's relaxed and fun. Yeah, sorry, this is me making small talks. Just a minute. I think I'll just check. Oh, nice. Artsy. How artsy? Yeah, I can imagine that. That's just 15 minutes before this. I was spending time in the balcony before it got really hot. But yeah, so I can imagine how. Hi, Divyansh. Yeah, always waiting for my buddy, my CBF buddy, to come here. Yeah, this one's good. Okay, guys, I'm just checking once more, and we should be good to go in a minute. Okay, it's great. We've got a few people already. Hi, Radhika. Okay, so that's few people. My life in quarantine has been just me keeping myself busy when not doing work. I think quarantine by itself has made me more introspective of my own lifestyle, and it's made me realize that certain good and bad things about it. But yeah, that's how it is, and I'm not sure if I what will be the new normal for us once we go back. I mean, at least for me. So let me just check in. Okay, guys, I think as soon as people join in, we'll just welcome them as along. But let's start the session for all those who have come. That's the thing about myths, they don't wait for people, and we can always retell them again and again whenever we want to tell them. And every time we tell them, there could be something new to say. So first of all, welcome all of you guys. This is the first session of Mythematical. So this is Mythematical, and I am your curiously caffeinated mathematician. Mythematical is basically a series there where we are going to be looking at various myths from around the world, and then we are going to be looking at the themes that ooze out or churn out by telling them, discussing them, or even listening to them. Okay, and that's the idea of Mythematical. So what we're going to do is it's going to be an hour session where I think in the first 40 minutes I'll be telling the stories, and then we will have questions. Request you that if you have any questions, please put it on the chat, which I'll read out mostly after the stories, or and if if I miss it out, I will do when all the stories are finished and we're just doing the discussion part. Since Insta live stream has a limitation of 1 hour, in case there is some discussion that was left from your side, if there's a question I didn't answer, we can just redo the live session again for a few minutes. So in case your question is not answered, or you had something to say, or you wanted to ask me something, request you to join in again in case the live stream ends. Okay, so yeah, I think just going ahead with the thing. So today's topic, the first pilot episode topic, was around flood myths. Okay, now we've all heard of the flood myths. We've heard at least one or maximum of two stories, right? We've also, I mean, these are some of the stories that always live in our imagination, especially when we think of the story of Noah, the story of even the Indian story of Matsya and all, which I'll be retelling in terms of the context altogether. But what's interesting is that the story of flooding is recurring throughout the different different cultures and different mythologies, and they're found in many of these creation myths. Creation myths are basically myths which talk about how the world was formed or reformed. And it's very interesting that many of the times the stories are always revolving about world had to get destroyed to be reborn, and the way to destroy was to cleanse humanity, cleanse the world. And the concept of cleansing comes out automatically using the idea of using flooding, especially by the gods. And I think that's an interesting thing. Why is this recurring? I mean, is there an anthropological reason that there was a common natural disaster that occurred and everyone got inspired? Hi, Ruchi. Great. We've just started. I was just giving the introduction and all. So, as I was saying, I mean, these myths are, around the world. And by the way, I mean, today we're going to talk about 5, but there are many cultural myths. There are many flood myths. I mean, there's from Egyptians, Chinese. There's also one from Japanese. There's like multiple stories. So it's not easy to cover it in one go. And the reason I wanted to cover 5 was because these stories are comparatively more better known, or they're more well preserved. And also they seem to influence each other, which we'll get to. So yeah, so just talking about that, I think it's a good idea. We'll dive into our first story, which is the story of Utnapishtim, that comes from the Babylonian myth. Okay, this story, just a little bit of a background. This story is actually a story within a story, a very common technique of storytelling. It's also in Mahabharata and Ramayana, where someone is telling a story of a story. And I'll just once again, I'll put an image just to show you what it looks like. So yeah. So this story, just to till I find an image, this story is basically a story of a larger which is basically coming from the story of the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is one of the oldest written epics or literature pieces, soon to become one of my favorite ones for many reasons. This flood story itself being part of one. And what's interesting is this story is about Gilgamesh finding this person called Utnapishtim. So what ends up happening is, just to give you an idea of, Gilgamesh is basically this king of Uruk, one of the first cities that was built. And by the way, Babylonian myth is something that comes from the Iran area. It's from Mesopotamia, written in Sumerian script. So yeah. So just to give you this thing, wait, I think this is a better picture. Yeah. So the story of Utnapishtim is basically when Gilgamesh, he is this egoistic king who ultimately he takes whatever he wants in his own kingdom. He randomly kidnaps new brides and all, and the gods, upon request from other people, they ultimately fashion a creature called Enkidu, who learns the way of civilization and comes and challenges Gilgamesh. But after their wrestling, they realize they're equally matched, and they end up becoming friends. In fact, best friends. And there's stories of them finally, going through multiple adventures, killing monsters, as friends, and both of them are like buddies. So it's basically the first half of the story is all a bromance story, ultimately when Enkidu gets cursed by one of the monsters that he's going to die early, and he dies of sickness, Gilgamesh is very heartbroken about his friends, and he starts worrying about his own death soon, and he wants to find immortality. And because he wants to find immortality, he remembers that there's this ancestor of him called Utnapishtim. So, through a long journey using clues and all, he finds Utnapishtim and he asks him, like, can you tell me how did you become immortal? So first Utnapishtim, disregards it. He's like, this is a weird request, I'm not going to tell you this. But Utnapishtim's wife kind of like urges him, like, just tell him, like, what's the harm? So Utnapishtim ends up telling the story, and he tells it about the story of the flood that happened and how he survived it. So what ends up happening in this story is basically the council of gods called the Anunnakis. The Anunnakis were secretly planning to have a flood across the world. Because the Anunnakis, this is comprised of like multiple gods. There's Anu, who's the sky father. There is Ea, the god of mischief. There is also Ishtar, the god of sex, and there's Enlil, the god of wind and earth and storm. And basically, Enlil is the one who says that we need to like ultimately do this because humans are becoming too populated, and they're making too much noise, and because of that, I can't sleep. This is actually one of the lines from the thing. So this story is basically the Epic of Gilgamesh are written across multiple tablets that were found, and this these tablets are basically the remains that we found, or the story. So the 11th tablet is the one that tells the story around line 1 to 20, 203, and by the way, there are many lines missing, so many of the stories are inferred. In fact, what I'm also telling you is slightly inferred, and that's the fun of it, right? You get the pieces and you make your own story. So in that the Enlil is basically saying the gods are, the gods are getting really pissed off. These humans are making too much noise, and he's not able to sleep, so he's going to do a flood, and this is supposed to be a secret, right? But Ea quietly goes to Utnapishtim, and through a reed wall, which is basically the houses that were made, people used to live in, through a reed wall, tells Utnapishtim about this plan, and he even tells him that, you need to build up a boat and take the seed of all the living things. In fact, what's interesting about this description is when he tells about in this prose, is he describes the kind of boat you need to build up, and the boat's specifications are very clear. In fact, he says that the boat's length, breadth, and height needs to be equal. It's almost like a cube kind of a format that he's asked him to make. And the first thing Utnapishtim asks is like, but wait, I mean, for this I'll need resources, and what am I going to tell the people of the city, right? So Utnapishtim, Ea kind of tells him an idea, and Utnapishtim goes to the city, the city of Shurupak, that's the city he used to live in, and he tells them that, guys, Enlil is very displeased with me, so I need to leave the city by building a boat, and I need to go somewhere. Don't worry, since after I'm gone, people will take care of this place for you. There will be rains of wheat and loaves of bread for you and all, so please help me out, which is kind of interesting, right? It's a very politician movie. He ends up like getting people to help him out by giving a false promise, and it's almost like he's doing insider trading. He knows something's going to go wrong, and he's basically like capitalizing on the situation. And that's interesting that this is coming from one of the oldest myths ever, right? And what's interesting is that people do help him out. They are ultimately making the thing for him, and when the before the flood comes, people are celebrating and they're helping him out. What's also interesting is that unlike other myths and all, this is a place where he and his wife do board. The seed of all the living things do come along, but he also gets like a navigator and a couple of other people he considers important. So this is one of those places where he's slightly little more lenient about who can come in, sort of a thing. And as soon as the flood comes, the gods finally, what they do is they even blaze the lands that were there. Like they almost like burn the land so that people don't survive, which is kind of like adding salt to the wound kind of a situation. But these gods are pretty vindictive. And then the flood comes, and the flood is just so massive, so this thing that this cube thing, just imagine like floating on the water, almost like a dice thrown, just tumbling and all sort of a thing. And sorry Ruchi, I'm seeing this thing. So how do I pin the theme? Wait. I'm not sure. I'm just this thing. It's okay. I will just go on about this thing. Sorry, this is the first time I'm also doing a live stream, so I'm just the thing. I put it on the comment. I'm just trying to see how do you. Oh, okay. I got it. Ruchi. I'm able to pin it. Yeah. Great. I was able to do that. Thanks. A new thing I learned. Okay. It's always interesting, right? You learn new things, by consulting the gods. So anyway, so what's interesting is like the world, this dice cube arc thing is just floating around, and the storm gets a little too much. In fact, it gets so bad that all the gods, they kind of like, go back. In fact, there's a very interesting line, that's from the tablet that says the gods were frightened by the flood and retreated, ascending to the heavens of Anu. The gods were cowering like dogs, crouching by the outer wall. Ishtar shrieked like a woman in childbirth. And that's a very weird image, right? Like the gods themselves they're basically freaking out. They're like, going and like trying to climb, and then they're, in fact, there's a whole speech where like she's lamenting that, oh my God, what have we done? Kind of a situation, right? And for 6 days and 6 nights, this goes on, like, Utnapishtim is just holding on and, managing and sort of a thing. And then finally the water comes down. And then on the 7th day, finally, like, Utnapishtim, takes this, he takes a dove and he puts it in the air, and the dove comes back. And then he takes and finally he takes a raven. He takes a raven and he sends it out, and the raven does not this thing does not come back. So that means there's a land near, because the bird has found a land, and that's the land. So finally they come to the mountain of Nimush. And Utnapishtim makes a sacrifice. He makes a sacrifice of a sheep, and he offers it to the god. And the gods smell this, and they're very pleased with him, and they come. And this is where, like, this thing Ishtar, she even says that, okay, you know what? This is a feast for all of us, but Enlil, because Enlil is the one who sent this flood. We shouldn't have done this. Ishtar even, like, makes a promise saying that, I'm really sorry. I promise on my necklace, which is like this thing called lapis lazuli, which is a sort of a blue metamorphic rock necklace. It's kind of interesting because this lapis is something that was highly sought out in the Indus Valley civilization, and it's also been found, in like Tutankhamun's, like mummies, like a face mask and also, which means that there was a lot of trading going on. And she makes a random promise on this necklace, which is kind of a random product placement. If you think about it, and she says that I will never do this kind of a flood thing situation. And that's when Enlil comes in, and he's like, wait, what? How are the people surviving here? How did people end up coming? Wasn't this supposed to kill everyone? How did the humans find out about this? So all the gods blame Ea. The god of Ea is like, okay, look, you talk to him, he's the one doing it. And Ea does something very interesting. Ea kind of just absolves himself. He's like, wait, before we get to that, first of all, let's talk about, did you really have to do the flood? So there's this whole verse where he talks about that, instead of the flood, you could have just sent a lion, you could have sent a wolf, you could have just sent a plague, like you could have just, had a disease, like COVID-19, like do something like a slap on the wrist of humanity. But flood really, like, let the punishment fit the crime. And he even says that, look, I didn't say anything. Utnapishtim kind of dreamt this up, and also don't blame me. And Enlil kind of like, listens to the argument. So he goes up to the boat, puts his hand on Utnapishtim and his wife, and he blesses them, and he says that, before the flood you were like mortals, but now since you've survived it, you will be like gods. And this is how he gets immortality. So this is the story which Utnapishtim tells, Gilgamesh. And obviously there's more to it about what Gilgamesh does and whether Gilgamesh is about to find, which is a different story and a different session altogether. But this is the first story of the Babylonian myths about the floods and that came in. And it's very interesting, right? The gods themselves are like cowering. They are almost apologetic about it. And there's this thing about a human being who figures something out. And I really like this. This is a very interesting story that, talks about a lot of things. It's not very prescriptive. It's almost like something happened and people are reacting to it. So yeah, that's the story of the Babylonian myth. Okay. So that goes to the next story, and now just imagine, like, the story. This is a story where, like, while this happened, where the gods were doing, accident, like, had caused something, they intend to cause, and they were apologetic. The Norse mythology is slightly different on that aspect. Okay, so yeah, in this story, first of all, to explain to you the Norse mythology, I need to tell you how the Norse world functioned. Okay, a quick backstory about it. So basically, before the world's creation and all, there was just two things. There was the Niflheim, and there was the Muspelheim. Okay, and Niflheim was this north icy world, and Muspelheim was this southern fire world. In which lived this monster called Surtur. I know people who must have watched the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Thor stories must be coming from that. Like, there are a lot of things that the Thor story in the Marvel has utilized from the Norse mythology, but you have to understand it's slightly different. Okay, so between these two, icy world and this fire world, was the Gunninga Gap. Gunninga Gap is basically a term for it's a term for the Great Yawn. This is like a big abyss where the ice and the water meet. Okay, and what ends up happening is, when the ice and water meet, finally water droplets are formed and water is dropping, and from one of these drops comes this primordial being called Ymir. Okay, Ymer. Okay, I'll show you an image of this guy. So yeah, so Ymir is basically the primordial being that who's born from this, and from another droplet comes this hornless cow, who's Audhumla. Okay, Audhumla is this hornless celestial cow, very big. Ymir gives birth to all these, the giants called the Jotuns. Okay, the Jotuns are basically these giants that come from him. He's like the ancestor of all of them. And Ymir ends up licking drinking the milk from the udders of Audhumla. While Audhumla is licking these icy blocks. And that's how they survive. Ultimately, Audhumla is, while she's licking these, I'm just going to put the image, okay? So, yeah. I'll come to I'll come to this, what the image is about, okay? But basically, from Audhumla, okay, when she's licking the icy blocks, she ends up licking this person out, okay? First, her hair comes out, then the face comes out, then the whole body comes out, and this is like a being called Buri, okay? And he's supposed to be this handsome and very bold person, and Buri is someone who ends up coming out, and he lives, and he ends up marrying one of the Ymir's children, and he has a son named Bor. Okay, so understand, Buri is basically marrying one of the children of Ymir, and Bor comes out, and Bor marries another person called Bestla. Okay, she is the daughter of one of the giants, and from Bor and Bestla come the three beings. There is Vili, Ve, and Odin. Okay, now it's actually supposed to be an alliteration. It's Vili, Ve, and Vodin, but in Anglicized version, Vodin becomes Odin. The person you all know, who's the father of Thor. Okay. So these three beings, ultimately are not very happy with the world, because now imagine they're living in a world where there's like a fire, there's ice, there's this big giant who's drinking the cow's milk, and there's nothing really happening in this world. There's just ice and fire. There's nothing there, and these guys really dream of variety. They want to have a world where there's like different things happening. There are beings who worship them and everything. They finally dream of having a sky. They have a dream of having water. They dream of having animals, plants. So they devise a plan. What they do is they surround they surround Ymir, and ultimately after surrounding Ymir, they stab him multiple times. Okay, and basically they kind of end up killing him. Okay, and Ymir finally, when he ends up falling down from his his skin turns into the earth, while his his brain turns into cloud, and his blood ends up turning into the water. But when the blood is just gushing out of his corpse, it's in such a big force that it starts perishing everything. It kills almost all the giants, save for one. There's Bergelmir and his wife, who are the lone survivor in this deluge of blood that just flows out. They hold on to this small object. Now, in different interpretation, that object is considered to be a trunk. Sometimes it's considered to be a wooden box, and different things. And depending on the interpretation, it also tells you something about how old this, Belgamir is, whether he was a smaller kid with someone he was married to at a very early age, or he was older. And he ends up floating on that. Okay. And they escaped this thing. He's the only giant who's able to escape along with his wife. He's the only one who's able to escape, and he ends up going to this place in this new world where Odin has formed. So Odin ends up helping form this Yggdrasil. Yggdrasil is basically a term for the world tree. So this is like a tree that comes out, and there are 9 worlds in it. Odin himself, along with Aesir's, these are the certain gods. They live in Asgard, while the humans live in Midgard, which is like called the middle world, which the humans come out and all. And like that, there are other worlds. And Belgamir ends up coming to a world called Jotunheim, and Jotunheim is a place where he ends up, having, he procreates and he gives birth to giants altogether. And what's interesting is that the giants never forget this. They always remember that this is something that this is something that that had happened to them. People had Odin was the reason why all his ancestors had died, right? So what's they always planned to take their revenge. And interestingly, in Norse mythology, giants are someone who are always fighting with the Aesir's, and there's also the stories of they're always menacing human beings, and that's why Thor is like this person who comes and fights the giants. What's also interesting is Loki, the god of mischief. All of us know him from the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but in the Norse mythology, he's just the god of mischief. He's basically a son of Farbauti and Lofe. Farbauti is basically a Jotunheim. He's a male Jotunheim who marries this woman called Lofe. Okay, and Loki is basically someone who has giant ancestry, and he's very mischievous in natures, and he keeps playing tricks with the Norse gods. Somehow he, there's a whole story of how he ends up being part of the the Aesir's. He lives with them, and he keeps playing these multiple tricks and this thing, and he gets himself into trouble, and equally gets himself out of the trouble. And then there, during the Ragnarok, which is the end of the world where all the humans are, the world is fighting, the gods are fighting this. Loki, along with the giants, are on the opposite side to fight the gods and bring about the destruction of the world. So there you go. That's the story of the flood, the Belgamir and blood itself. What's interesting is the Belgamir itself, his own description and all is not too long. It's very little. There's not too much. His wife is not even named. So in this story, the story is more of the creation, and the blood flood is basically just something that happens as an accident. And humans are someone who just, come out of this blood and all sort of a thing. So we kind of have to be grateful for this situation. So it's interesting, right? I mean, like in the previous story, the gods did something accidentally and humanity had to survive. And in this story, the gods decided to take up action because of their ambition, and humans were just a byproduct. Okay. So that's the second story. So I've been showing the images. So guys, I'm going to keep showing some images and all. I don't want to spend too much time with the images, this thing. I'll just show 1 or 2 images because that's something that I can send it to you guys also later. But what's interesting is these are some of the imaginations. I would also want you guys to imagine it, how it's being said, because that's the fun of it. Some of these stories were actually just written as text or just a small description, and these drawings and paintings are just artistic representation using modern sensibilities. Okay, cool. Moving on to the next story. Hope you guys are enjoying the stories. The thing. By the way, one thing: the Belgamir's name in Norse mythology means a mountain yellow or a bear yellow. So he's the one who seems to cry out when the floods come in, but no one listens to him, and then he saves himself. So that's how the story of the Norse mythology comes in. Yeah, so now we will move on to the next story, which comes from the Greek mythology. Okay, so from the Greek mythology, and I'll get back to this image, what exactly is coming this thing. So just a little bit of a backstory, and if you guys had attended the previous a session that I had done with Sandeep and all, where I was talking about disasters, we spoke about we spoke about Pandora, like how Pandora was the first woman created by Zeus. And she opens a jar, or like in later modern translations, a box where all the evils in the world come out because Zeus had planned it, right? So Zeus was basically very vindictive, because what had happened was Prometheus, who had created the mortals, had stolen the fire from the gods and given it to humans. And there was another time where, like, in a certain sacrifice, Prometheus had switched the sacrifice, where he gave the fats to the gods, and he took the meaty flesh and he gave it to humans. So Zeus was really, really angry. Zeus was ultimately like, I am going to take revenge. He took revenge on Prometheus by chaining him up to a cliff and having a vulture eat out his liver, which used to grow up every time. But at the same time, he wanted to hurt his prize creation, humans, and he had decided that enough is enough. I am going to destroy them. In fact, because of there was this king called Lycaon, the king of Arcadia, who had sacrificed his own son and fed to the gods, which was considered a big taboo in the according to the gods of feeding humans. Cannibalism was looked down upon, at least something was. I'm so glad about that. Which kind of drew the last straw for Zeus, and Zeus was decided that this age of men has to end, and I am going to ultimately destroy it with the flood. Now there are multiple versions of this, which talks about, like, Zeus himself decided that okay, let's save one human being. There's another story which Athena, the goddess of wisdom, says that, look, it's great that you won't destroy it, but have someone, like, let's save someone so that they can, like, they can be the better people. They will worship us, because remember, the Greeks had also created these gods so as to get worshipped. As egoistic and, like, self-centered they had to get worshipped, and that's the point of humans, right? So Zeus, in some myths, and in other myths, it's Prometheus himself who had told his own son Deucalion, Deucalion, that there's going to be a flood coming in, so you need to be prepared. And he had asked him to construct a chest, like a small box which he could lie inside. And Prometheus's brother was something that like Epimetheus, who's married to Pandora. They had their own kid, and her kid name was Pyrrha. Pyrrha is a girl who marries Deucalion. So basically they are couples, and they're the only one, when the flood comes, they stock up everything. What's interesting about this story is that no animals are saved in this. It's only those two with a lot of equipments and, like, like provisions that they had. And finally, like, this thing goes on, and the flood kind of cleanses everyone. People try to run, but ultimately the flood just destroys everything. What your image you're seeing is basically a sense of destruction that happens. Dead bodies are just floating around, and just carcasses are just floating. And then finally Deucalion, after 9 nights, by the way, just to give you a number count, so if in the first, in the Utnapishtims, the story is 7 days. In the Norse, so there's no exact number given, ranging from 3 days to multiple days. But in this story, there are 9 days and 9 nights is when they keep floating, and ultimately when the rain ceases. And this thing, they finally go to Parnassus. The Mount Parnassus is where the chest ends up, lodging. And when the deluge is over, these couples come out and they sacrifice an animal, thanking the gods. They are basically just thankful that they are alive. And what Deucalion, Deucalion by this age, he's almost 82 years old. So this is also a time where the mortal and the titans and all were ultimately very old. The standard. This thing Deucalion and Pyrrha, they end up walking around in this land, and they find there's a temple where there is Themis, the goddess of justice, and she's also an oracle. And they ask, like, what do we do? Like, how do we even begin civilization again? I mean, everyone's dead. And what's interesting is Themis, he says this particular riddle. He's like, cover your heads, ungirdle your garment, and throw the bones of your mother behind your shoulders. Which kind of confuses Deucalion and Pyrrha. Like, what does this mean? I mean, they're surely their mother. I mean, Pera's mother, Pandora, is probably dead, right? I mean, like, the flood had killed everyone. So, I mean, Pandora is probably dead. And Deucalion doesn't even know his mother, because in various, different mythologies, different mothers are given. Clymene is given as one of the mothers, and also he didn't even know whose his mother is, let's blame the mythologists for that, for not remembering that. So it's like, okay, we don't have a mother. But then they think about it and they're like, wait, mother, right? Mother, they're like, wait, we all have one mother, Gaia, the earth mother. Ultimately, the whole world had come from her. So technically, the earth can be considered a mother, and the rocks can be considered the bones. So they quickly, they cover their head. And just 1 second, I'll show you a particular image which has that thing. So they cover their head, and ultimately they completely disrobe, and they start throwing stones behind their behind their backs. And what ends up happening is so that's this thing, they're trying to throw the stones and all. What ends up happening is that when they turn back, they see that there are human beings formed. Every stone that Deucalion had thrown behind him turned into man, and Pera's stones finally became women, and this is how they started repopulating the earth. Gods were also happy because Deucalion and Pera were someone they really admired, and this time gods hoped that humans will be much better and they won't piss them off again. So yeah, that's the story of the Greek flood myth. So what's interesting about this story is that this story was done with a very vindictive tone of the gods. Zeus really want to destroy it. There's also this thing of challenging humans that, okay, are they up for the task? And the human beings kind of rose to show that they're worthy of it. And that's why they were able to do that, right? So this is a story. No, Odysseus' story is slightly different. There is certain similarities in the Greek mythologies also. Odysseus comes much later. The age of heroes has not really begun. This is the Bronze thing. In fact, this flood myth leads to the age of heroes and all. So Niti, I think that's a different story. But yeah, you're free to mix and match these things. So yeah, that's the story of Greek mythology about the flood myth. Let's move on to the fourth mythology, and this is probably one of the more famous ones across the world, which is the story of Noah. And this comes from the Bible. And what's interesting is many of the influences of the earlier stories you will see out here, okay, and that's something that keeps coming out, okay. And this is coming from the Bible. So what's interesting is that there are some direct statements of the stories, so in terms of interpretation there could be varieties, but in terms of the source there's only one, unlike these are the other ones which were a lot of oral tellings and all, right? Now, just to give you a backstory of the myth, we know that Noah was the one who made the boat and sort of a thing, but why did God really end up doing the flood in the first place, right? I mean, so there's this idea that the biblical gods are someone who are basically always he's someone who's very vindictive, right? He's someone who's very vindictive, but that's not true. I mean, to be honest, yes, the gods can be vindictive. He is a bit temperamental, but to be honest, if you read the entire Bible, there is a very particular reason why he's vindictive. So just to give you the backstory, see, when he created Adam and Eve, and he told him that, okay, this Garden of Eden is for you, live and prosper and sort of a thing. Just do not eat from the tree of knowledge, which is what Eve does, right? Because the snake ultimately tells her that God doesn't want you to become like gods, and this is give you all the knowledge in the world and sort of a thing. What's interesting is that God made humans, but he gave them a choice to decide what is good and bad. Okay, so this story, what's interesting is when the humans fail him and they get kicked out of the garden because they failed him, God keeps wanting to bring back that sort of Garden of Eden, and he's like, I'm going to end up showing that humans are worthy of it. But the problem is, in the first 6 chapters, the chapter 1 of Genesis, chapter 1 to chapter 6, the God's key, the God keeps giving humans a chance, but humans keep failing it. So after Adam and Eve, there's a story of humans multiplying, and violence ranging. There is like this guy named Cain and Abel, brothers, and Cain kills Abel. In fact, that's the birth of murder, and because of jealousy. Which again, God was not this thing. That's not what the God wanted from human beings. And one of Cain's descendant, Lamech, is even a man who is known for violence. He kind of boasts about all his exploits and sort of a thing. So this, the sins and evil is something that is becoming very intensified. And ultimately, this is just upsetting God. This is he doesn't want this to happen. He's like, okay, what is happening? I'm trying to give you guys a chance. And you have to understand, Noah itself is the 10th prophet. He's the 10th prophet amongst the chain of this thing. And the God, he is utterly sad with this wickedness of people and sort of a thing. So what he tells Noah is that I will destroy the earth, the people I've created, and with them the animals, birds, and creeping things. In fact, he tells this to Noah that I will establish my covenant with you. Okay. Now this is very interesting. Covenant itself is this concept that I'm going to make this sort of a sanctuary with you, which is like a garden. So covenant itself is like a group, right? So I'm going to make a covenant with you. So what you need to do is you need to, so the lines are exactly I will establish my covenant with you, and I will go into the ark with your, saying you will go into the ark with your wife, your sons, and their wives. I'm going to destroy all the flesh because the world is full of violence. Build an ark of gopher wood with rooms inside, 3 decks and a door. Cover it and out with a pitch. Again, what's reminiscing is the fact that here also he kind of gives instruction of how to build it. So God, almost like an architect, is giving you instructions of what to do. And Noah kind of just takes the instruction. What's interesting also is that Noah doesn't have a voice in this story. He never speaks really, at least in this during the flood and all. And the God even tells him that, gives a very specific thing that you need to take 7 pairs of all clean animals, males and his mates, a pair of animals that are not clean, the male and his mates, 7 pairs of birds from the heaven, and to keep their offsprings alive on the face of the earth. So very clear instructions of who all to take, right? And yeah, sorry, I think, I hope you guys are able to see me. Hello? Hello? Are you guys able to see me? Yeah, sorry. I don't know. I wasn't able to see myself. Yeah. Sorry guys. I think, I was... Oh, that's the thing. Noah never asked why, because Noah was this, so he's considered to be this blameless man. In fact, that's very interesting. The term that is described to why he was saved was because he was the blameless man. He didn't have anything that ultimately caused him to be destroyed in this flood, right? Yeah. So what's interesting is that when God tells him this, and the flood begins to come, and the flood is described in a very, very descriptive way. It's it's ultimately described: the fountains of the deep broke open, the windows of the heavens were opened, rain poured for 40 days and 40 nights, the water rose until every high hills and on the earth was covered. Everything that lived on the land perished in the raging water floods. So this is almost like a description that happens. So for 40 days it rained, but the water flooding happened for 150 days, So which is interesting, because a lot of people think that flood happened for 40 days, but the flood didn't happen for the 40 days. The flood happened for 150 days. And what's interesting is in the Bible there's a line that says that God remembered Noah and the animals on the ark, and that's when the water receded. So it's almost like the God caused the flood. Noah is floating around, and then God after 150 days oh yeah, wait, what about Noah? He just literally goes into this sort of a mode, and he's and then the water recedes, and the ark comes on top of the thing Ararat, the mountain Ararat, and that's where it stops. Okay. And this is where Noah sends out, he sends out a dove. Ultimately, after he sends out a raven, raven comes back, he sends out a dove, and finally the dove comes. The dove doesn't come back, and that's when he knows that on this on the seventh day of this time, he ends up believing that okay, we are near the land. And what's interesting is when he finally comes to the land, he makes a sacrifice, and I think it's like a norm. It's like, God, you destroyed it, I must pray to you, and sort of a thing. So he makes an altar, and God says this to him very clearly: never again will I curse the ground because of a man and send a flood to destroy all things, even though mankind's heart is evil from childhood. And he even says to Noah that, be fruitful, increase in number, and fill the earth. So basically, go do it, just increase human population, and because of this promise, he makes to Noah, he says that, I'm going to give you a sign of my bow as this thing. And that's why we see the rainbow. The rainbow is a sign of God promising that he'll never do something like this again, even if humanity fails him. Okay. Now, Noah is, Noah goes on to live in this thing. And obviously the story also, goes on where, Noah is not exactly without his flaws. He tills the land, he even grows wine, and he gets drunk, and there's this whole story with his own kids, kids and all, and humanity fails again and again. So what's interesting to understand in the story is that the idea of sending a flood by the gods was almost as a judgment, because human wickedness was so much. So think of it this way, like God had made the world from the watery depths. This thing in the starting thing, he ends up finding land, and he makes the sun, he makes sort of a thing. So the idea of flood is sort of a decreation of the world. The idea of earth sinking back into the chaotic waters so that God can restart the creation altogether. And if you see the parables, ultimately Noah is this person who ends up in a wicked time, he ends up surviving the watery floods. But he's not the leader that we are waiting for, because ultimately he also fails, right? And that's the reason why, if you realize that the end of this flood myth is not by Noah, but actually all these stories are pointing to Jesus in this story. Jesus is this person who comes during a wicked time, but this time, he gets drowned in the waters, in the water, water of death. He ends up killing himself. He ends up suffering, unlike Noah, who doesn't suffer from this, right? He ends up taking the sin of man, and he ends up ultimately purging his own self. So that's basically God doing that so as to repent for the sin of man, just to give humanity another chance. So if you see that way, all these stories are pointing towards Jesus. So that's the story of Noah. So yeah, that was the story from the Bible. And what's interesting is this story is basically focusing on divinity providing a punishment while ultimately giving a solution to humanity. And that brings us to the final story, which is from the Hindu mythology. And this story comes from the Shatapatha Brahmana and various Puranas. There's also Matsya Purana and Vishnu Purana and sort of a thing, which kind of rework the stories, and they make him into the story and becoming a larger, a story of an avatar of the god itself. Okay. Again, quick backstory, because floods need explanation, why the floods end up happening in the first place. So what's interesting is that the flood, the flood itself is actually not called a flood in this thing. It's called pralaya. Pralaya is this idea of everything just finishing, that's basically ending, right? And you have to understand there are basically 4 yugas. Okay, I hope you guys know the 4 yugas. Okay, it's very interesting. People end up mixing up the things. The first one is Satyug, then is Treta Yuga, okay, then is Dwapar Yuga, and then is Kal Yuga. Okay, the reason just to remember this is Treta Yuga actually means 3, but it's actually the second age, and Dwapar Yuga is actually which means 2. It's actually the third thing. There's been a goof up in the mythology. There's a story behind that, but that's for a later time. And each of the yuga is basically considered to be a day in Brahma's life. So every time Brahma goes to sleep, a new yuga comes. Okay, and the thing is, Brahma, as every time a yuga ends, the gods need to prepare for renovation. So all the 3 gods, Vishnu, Shiva, and Brahma, they have their own duties. So Brahma is also given this task where ultimately, since he's the one who holds the Vedas, that every time this happens, he has to make sure the Vedas do survive for the next stage, because Vedas are the only thing that are eternal, right? But unfortunately, what ends up happening is after the Satyug is it's ending, Brahma decides to go to sleep a little too soon, and he ends up like, just before the thing, he gets up going to this thing, and from his nose comes the thing Hayagriva. Hayagriva is this horse-headed, like Asura, okay, who comes out of his nose, and Brahma is like almost sleepy, and he's like, just chanting out the, the Vedas and all. So Hayagriva just like takes the Vedas, consolidates them into a tangible form, and he puts it in his mouth and goes down into the ocean to hide. Okay. At the same time, the question becomes that, how are we going to ensure how these Vedas are going to survive and who's going to survive it? And this is where Vishnu decides that, okay, you know what? I will step it up. I'm going to retrieve the Vedas and I'm going to see if the mankind survives. So he comes up with this idea that, you know what? I'm going to do something called taking avatars. Okay. And he ends up taking his first avatar, which is the story. Okay. So Satyavrata, okay. Satyavrata is basically the king of Dravid, okay, and he's the devotee of Vishnu. And in the later tellings, he's going to be called Manu, and you'll understand why the name Manu itself comes in. So Satyavrata is basically washing his hands in the in a river when a small fish, he's about to pray and he notices a small fish just floating around, and she's like, help me, the big fish wants to eat me. Can you do this? So he's like, okay, sure, don't worry, little fish, I'll save you. Yeah. Sorry, I keep forgetting the pictures are very important. So this is a picture of this thing. In fact, this is a better picture. So now he puts the fish in a jar, but soon enough the fish starts growing, sort of a thing. It just becomes bigger and bigger and bigger, and ultimately it ends up he moves it to like a bigger bigger jar. It becomes bigger, and then he moves it to a tank. In fact, the description of a tank is like it's more than 2 yojanas, which is 16 kilometers by 16 kilometers with 32 kilometers height. There's like a description also of how much the width of the tank is, and this fish is just growing. I just wonder how much he must have eaten. Okay, this fish must be eating, and then he puts it. He diverts it to a river, and this river is not able to contain the fish itself. So finally, it ends up going to the ocean, and this is where this thing Satyavrata is like, wait a minute, you don't seem to be like an ordinary fish. I feel like there is some you are no ordinary fish. There is something that Sandeep, I put the picture. You can see it right now. Yeah. So basically, he's talking to the fish. The fish is glowing now, and he ends up saying, please reveal yourself. Who are you? And this is where, Vishnu comes out. He's like, that's right. I'm not an ordinary fish. I'm Vishnu himself, and I need to tell you that. So I need to tell you that there is going to be a pralaya coming in. I'm going to come back to you. So please prepare a boat, and don't worry. I will guide you out of this. Just follow my instruction. Just make sure that you are getting all the medicines in the world, okay, and the living beings, and get the Saptarishis. So what's interesting is, the instruction is not to save your family and all, just yourself, the medicines, the Aushadhis, certain animals, and the Saptarishis. In fact, that's the thing. Like the Saptarishis were actually the ones that were saved along with Manu and along with Satyavrata. Okay, and he says that he asked why me? So he's like, you have been you showed by saving a fish and protecting it from the wild, you showed that you can move away from the jungle law to a civilized law, and you showed dharma. You showed that as a human being you can bring about lawfulness. Okay, and that's the reason you are going to be the first man in this. Okay, and that's the reason. The word manav, okay, is basically comes from man, a person who can think, a person who can who can act, right? And that's the reason manushya, manav, these have the word with man. Okay, and finally he calls him that you shall be known as Manu. Okay, the first of the man. Okay, because in this sort of a thing you will be the one ultimately bringing revival to the mankind. Okay, now finally the fish goes away. Now the fish, when he goes away, he basically goes through Hiragriva, and there's a whole battle that happens. Hiragriva, Hiragriva has like the Vedas in his mouth. So basically, the fish coils around him, like tightens him, and like makes Hiragriva scream. So while he screams, all the ultimately the Vedas finally come out. So there's no ladies right now. So honestly speaking, the first I'll come to the ladies part. Mythologies have a way of always showing how the ladies were created. Okay, and if you can guess it, ladies were created for a very specific purpose. So anyway, Hiragriva finally leaves it out, and okay. By the way, I'm getting a timer, which is like I think the session is going to end in like 2 minutes. So I will just connect back again. So please join in. I will just wrap up this thing, and we can just do some questions. So finally, Hiragriva leaves out the Vedas, and the Vedas are captured in this. And ultimately Manu takes the Vedas, and finally he comes back when the Pralaya is happening. By this time, ultimately Manu has built the ship. And the fish has this sort of a horn on